That is such a nice introduction. I think one that only my mother would believe. So thank you. I'm really so proud and excited to be here. I've spoken so many times, pretty much on a weekly basis before Jewish communities, and I also speak in front of other larger Jewish communities, but this is actually the very first time I've ever spoken to a Korean congregation or audience, I guess. And so, yeah, and thank you for the invitation. My mother, I know, would be very proud. She usually says to her friends, my daughter, the rabbi. But today she can say, my daughter, the Hanguk saram. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about where I've come from. I was born between two worlds. It was in an American Army hospital in Seoul, South Korea. My mother is Buddhist, and I was actually born in Japan. And my father was a Jewish American who ended up in Korea because he was a civil engineer in the Army. At a young age, I think my parents realized that this hermit kingdom was not actually the most friendly place for us half-breed children like me and my sister. And not to mention that it was pretty impossible to have any kind of Jewish community in Korea. So when I was about 5 years old, we moved to the thriving Jewish metropolis of Tacoma, Washington. I think we increased the size by 50%. So now you could take my mother out of Korea, but you can't take the Korean out of her. So I grew up on a very steady diet of kimchi and Korean folk tales and a weekly encounter with the dae cloth that took an entire layer of skin off my body. So I understand Korean pain. Yeah. And she also imbued in me a very strong sense of Korean values. Respect and deference for your parents and for elders, a real focus on education, and a near impossible work ethic. My mother was the first in her family to go to college, and she would always tell me and my sister this story of how she spent 6 months in a Buddhist temple, I don't know, waking up at 6 and like sweeping it out and then studying for the one test that determined your future for where you went for college. And she proudly said that she got a full scholarship to Ewha, which was the finest women's university, where she got a degree in English literature. So this was sort of like the ethos of the Korean spirit that she helped put into me. If I would come home with a report card that had anything but straight A's, my mother would say, "You are Asian, not Bayesian." Never mind. It wasn't even a B, it was an A minus, but it didn't matter to her. It was like not perfect. I would say, "Mom, you can't expect perfection." She says, "I don't expect perfection, I expect you to live up to your potential." So, now, having a Korean mother run a Jewish household is a funny thing. It had its own strange convergences, like our traditional Shabbat Friday night meal was always bulgogi and banchan. And then there was the year that we didn't have one of the ingredients for our Passover Seder plate. And if you don't know, there are many ingredients on a Seder plate, but there's something called maror, which is usually horseradish, and it's like a very spicy thing. And so my mom was like, "We'll use the kimchi." So she put the kimchi on the Seder plate, and she said, "Angela, you take the best of both worlds. Kimchi just like maror, only better." So I knew then that we were never going to be a normal Jewish family. So now fortunately I found that my mother's Korean values at the core were very aligned with the Jewish values of my father's family and the ones that I was being raised with in my synagogue community as well, especially the stress on education and hard work and respect for tradition. But there was one difference that I noticed between my Korean and Jewish cultural attitudes, and it was around money. Money seemed to be probably the most frequent source of argument in my house growing up. We grew up pretty solidly middle class. My mother was an ESL teacher for 30 years in the public schools, and I'm proud to say she also founded the Korean language program in the Tacoma Public schools and helped get the Korean SAT test approved for America. So that was one of her many contributions to the Korean community. My father was in charge of large construction projects. So we didn't seem to have a lot of extra money, but somehow my parents always seemed to find money for piano lessons, for ballet lessons, for the occasional, every 3 or 4 years family trip to Korea where we would go back and visit our relatives. So there was complete agreement my parents had about those priorities. But my father, in his study, he always had an enormous stack of, this is back in the days when people did this by mail, solicitations for donations to all sorts of organizations, from the Cancer Society to my synagogue, to Israel Bonds, to the Muscular Dystrophy Society. And my father never met a solicitation he didn't feel compelled to give to. And so I would remember that my father would sit at his desk and write out multiple checks. Usually they were very small, like $5, $10 at the most, but he always gave. And then my mother would come in and nag him about this and say, honey, why you do that? She said, we don't have the money for that. She said, you don't even know anyone with muscular dystrophy. Like, why are you doing this? And my father would say, we're obligated to do so. If we can, we must. And as a kid, I always worried that we were going to run out of money, because my mom made it sound like we were going to run out of money. But my dad kept writing those checks. But then the interesting thing was, every 3 or 4 years, we would prepare for our trip to Korea as a family. And I'd go with my mom to the department store, and I don't know how many hundreds of dollars we spent on, like, I think Estee Lauder creams for all my Korean emos. Does all Koreans do that? Like, I don't know. So we would, and then we'd spend a fortune on that, shove an entire suitcase with, I don't know, Estee Lauder creams, and then every relative that we saw in Korea would give a big envelope of money. And so I was like, Mom, I thought we were running out of money. And I realized it wasn't that my mother wasn't a generous person. She just had a very different sense of, like, who you gave your money to and how it was and how you took care of your own. And I don't know if this is, I don't want to make an enormous generalization off of just my own family, but I did have some other Korean friends and other family, and this seemed to be a little bit more, that these, in some ways, this anecdotal story of my family was somehow tapped into a larger sort of cultural difference I felt between the ways Koreans sort of approached money and giving and the ways Jews did as well. So I thought that what I would do, I think that I was asked to come here because I think in a wonderful way there was a sense that perhaps the Korean community, we don't maybe give as much money into the larger world as we could as a community, or we wanted to challenge the ways that we think about money in this community. And I think as a rabbi, I'm able to articulate in some way the very strong value of giving that's built into the Jewish tradition, that has translated into the fact that the Jewish community is probably per capita one of the most philanthropic communities in the world. So I'm just going to give you a thumbnail sketch because we don't have a ton of time, and then I think maybe the best way to approach thinking about this is to do a question and answer, which I'm very happy to do. But I think fundamentally at the core, in order to understand Jewish giving, I have to teach you the word for Jewish giving, which is Sadaqa. Has anyone ever heard that word before? A few of you. Okay, so let's see. Oh, I'm missing the, one second. There we go. Okay. So usually when you think of giving money away, you think of the word charity. And that is a word that comes out of the Christian tradition, and it comes from a root around mercy or compassion. So when you think about charity, you think about being, that your heart is moved to give in some way, out of a sense of compassion or mercy. And so charity is an act of generosity. It's a voluntary giving of money to those who are in need. I think that probably rings true as like a definition of what charity is. That's not the word that Jews use for giving money away. It's Sadaqa. And Sadaqa comes at its root in the Hebrew from the word for justice or righteousness. And so the Jewish view of giving money away is not about whether or not you feel like it or if your heart is moved, or even if it's about mercy or compassion, because it's not. It's actually about justice. It's about whether or not you're actually leveling the playing field and creating more justice in the world. And so there's a sense that there is an obligation to give because it is the right and just thing to do. So of course there are rules in the Torah, which is our Bible, or pieces of the Bible, the first 5 books of what you would call the Old Testament. And in it are rules around tithing, which are 10%, and then in subsequent literature that the rabbis have, they lay out what that means in terms of really how much you're supposed to give. But it's not really about whether or not you feel like it or feel merciful or compassionate. It is just considered your obligation to give. So here are a few principles that I think undergird. I come from, I guess, one of the things that I will share with you that is like a point of pride is that I learned from a genealogical study because I was in a show called Finding Your Roots, which is about tracing back your genealogy line. So someone else did this research for me, but I found out that my 19th great-grandfather, in a direct line on my mother's side, was King Sejong the Great. So you can just call me Jewish princess, Korean princess or something, I don't know. But anyway, or your highness, I don't know. Okay, but anyway, this amazing line that, and King Sejong, of course, created Hangul, which is the phonetic Korean alphabet. And what was kind of amazing when I learned that story, which we learned right before I took my children to Korea for the first time 3 years ago. So it was really awesome going in that like big boulevard in Seoul with like the huge golden statue of King Sejong, and my children were like, "Hi, Grandpa!" So, yeah, whatever. It was pretty good. And anyway, so we, my mother, hearing this information, it was one of those things that was kind of in the family lore, but she didn't really know. But she started to understand her own father in a different way. First of all, she grew up in a tiny town called Hyungpoon, which is outside of Daegu, and her father was one of the only people who was actually literate in their community, so he was the town storyteller. He would read novels, people would bring like a bag of rice, at least this is how the lore goes, and he would tell stories, and this is kind of how he got sort of paid. But he kind of refused to do real work, and my mom kind of felt like it was because he was lazy. When she learned he was kind of like Yangban, like part of like a landed class that like really felt like this was sort of beneath them. He would read books, but he wouldn't do work. It was sort of a different thing. But there was also a very different attitude about how land worked, because he came from the family where he was the younger brother, and his older brother basically took the land. It was his to own, and he didn't really share it. And so, you know, the younger brother ended up with very little. So I don't know exactly how this works, but there was a real strong sense of the way you got to own something, and it got passed down in certain ways, and it didn't always necessarily have to be shared. And that's very different than an attitude that is kind of continuously emphasized in Jewish tradition, that you can take some of this stuff, but you don't really own it. It's really just lent to you, including land. Pretty much everything has that attitude. So I'll show one quote that comes from Leviticus. "The land must not be sold permanently because the land is mine." This is God speaking. "You are merely strangers and temporary residents in relation to me." So if you begin with a fundamental feeling that this is not yours to own, you're just basically on here temporarily, and that really you're only here because of the grace of God, then it really changes your attitude about your relationship to that land and everything else that you own. So therefore, the second principle I'd say is, therefore you have to share. So this is one of the most famous laws I'm going to show you next that Jews talk about. We refer to it just in shorthand as peah, which means corners. And it's so built into the way Jews talk about giving that my son, when he was, who goes to a Jewish day school, was told he had to construct a sanctuary that reflected Jewish values. The first thing he did was he created corners in the 4 corners of the synagogue. He literally made little boxes. It was a diorama. And he said, based on the principle of peah, or corners, I'm going to make each of these corners a place where you could donate something, like coats go here, cans of food go here, and whatever else. So here's the law. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap all the way to the corners of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall not pick your vineyards bare, or gather the fallen fruit of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the stranger. I, the Lord, am your God. So that idea that if that land is not fully yours, you don't get to feel like you own all of it. And in fact, God says, leave those corners of your field unpicked. And leave the fruit and the gleanings that fall, leave them for people to pick up. So there's several principles at play here that I think are important. One is that you don't actually, it could be a very different thing if it said, pick all your food and then give a quarter of it to poor people. What's different about saying that you pick it and then you give it to the people who are poor versus leaving it for people to come and get it themselves? There's a very different sense of dignity that you give to the poor, that they get to glean that for themselves and have it for themselves. And it's a sense that in some ways, those corners belong to them. And they recognize that they are entitled to something. That's the just and right thing. And so it's very different than sort of feeling like it's a charitable act where you, out of the graciousness of your heart, give something of yours to them. It kind of is a reminder it was never yours to begin with. And I think just to kind of tack it off in case you didn't get the point, it ends by saying, I am the Lord your God. Meaning, like, in case you were wondering who it belonged to, it's mine. So this is a really pivotal. This particular portion is part of the Holiness Code in Leviticus, which is read every year on the holiest day of our year on Yom Kippur in synagogues. But it's actually read several times during the year, and it's one of our kind of most known laws around Sadaqa, our obligation to give, and how we give it. Make giving a habit. This is something that I don't think I articulated or understood that what my father was doing was a very Jewish idea that giving is a habit. And I'll give you an example of this from a text, that comes from Moses Maimonides, a very famous philosopher from the 12th century. He says, when a person gives to an appropriate person 1,000 gold pieces at once, he would not be considered at the level of generosity in this one large action as someone who gave 1,000 gold coins one at a time, and through each coin was generous, because this multiplies the act of generosity 1,000 times, and the trait of generosity is strengthened in this person, while the other one only had his spirit raised to the awareness to do good once and then stopped. So we could break this text down in a lot of different ways, but I'll just point out a couple things. So this is just sort of saying, if you give $1,000 once, you're not considered as worthy as someone who gives out 1,000, the same amount, but in 1,000 little increments of one coin. We could argue whether or not we think it's better to give, a bigger chunk than a smaller. But part of what they're saying is, you want to be in the habit of giving. This is sort of like what I imagined with my father when he would make those small checks. Maybe he could have made one big donation to a charity he thought was really important, but he actually gave continuously and regularly, so that it became just a habit that he knew that once a week or so he would sit down and write a couple checks. And I also think that part of this is a judgment on the fact that someone gave one time a very large sum, but then it sounds like they never gave it again. So their spirit was not moved to actually become a person whose heart is thinking about giving, because they only really did it once. So instead, there's a real difference with someone who might only have enough to give once, and then once, and then once, but that you kind of create this habit of giving. So that's also built into our tradition. The last kind of text that I want to bring is this idea that there are actually levels to giving. There's giving and there's giving. It's all good, and ultimately it needs to go to who it goes to. But we know there are different motivations for why people give, and there are different levels in terms of just sort of the higher moral stake in the giving. So Maimonides, again, Rabbi Moses Maimonides, lays out 8 levels of Sadaqa. Sometimes it's called the ladder of Sadaqa or whatever. This is also a pretty well-known text in Jewish communities when we talk about. So I'm going to start with number 8 and work our way up. So the first one is that you give begrudgingly. We all know what that's like. It's just like someone's like, can you come to my benefit? Okay. But you do give. You might not have the right spirit around it, but you give. So ultimately, that's still good. It counts because you gave, but you don't give with a particularly great attitude. The next level is giving less than you should, but at least giving it cheerfully. So argue that number 8 is, it's one thing. I think you shouldn't give less than you should, but look, it's good that you at least say, I'm really happy to give you my $2. So, okay. The next level up is giving after being asked. So if you can imagine that you see someone who is sort of in a desperate state and they've asked you and you give to them, that's good. Not quite as good as giving before being asked, where you just recognize a need in someone and you save them and you spare them from the indignity of having to ask you for the money. And so you help them out before they've even asked. The level above that is giving when you don't know the recipient's identity, but the recipient knows your identity. So imagine this as, what I love about this is you feel like I'm willing to give to this category of people or this organization, even if I don't really know them personally because I believe in it. But the fact that the person who's received the money knows who you are, they might have a sense of not only shame when they see you, but also a sense of obligation to have to do something for you. So it's a pretty good level, but they're still not quite as high as the next level, which is giving when you might know who the recipient is, but they don't know you. So they will not, the person who received the money doesn't have to feel an obligation to you. And so, you might want to give because you know this person, but they don't know who gave to them, and that way they don't feel that sense of obligation. We're getting close to the top too. You can imagine giving when neither party knows the other's identity. This is, by the way, I don't know how often, when I think about how many buildings and organizations have Jewish people's names on it, I don't know how big Jews are on anonymous giving, but you could argue that it's good to put your name on because it encourages other people to give. But we're reaching the very pinnacle of giving here, which is that you're willing to give without even people knowing that you gave, because you just know it's the right thing to do, and you also don't need to know who got the money. Which it's not about it being your friend or your family or anyone else. You just know there's a need and you're willing to give, and you don't have to know who that person is. And so this is the second to highest level of giving, that you're willing to do it anonymously and not knowing who the recipient is. So I would give, $10 to the person who can guess what a top category might be in the ladder of giving, because it's hard to imagine what goes above this. Does anyone know? I want to take a guess. What could you imagine would be the highest level of giving? Anyone? Okay. I'll tell ya. Dun, dun, dun. Enabling the recipient to become self-reliant. This is the don't give them a fish, teach them how to fish principle. The idea is if you could actually help someone ultimately get out of the cycle of needing the gift at all, that is the highest level of giving you can give. So if you could figure out ways that you can give someone a microloan so they could start a business, that's even better than continuing to have to give them money where they have to continue to ask for it from you. So I think that part of why I give you this is not so that you can memorize the ladder of giving, but because these short texts that I brought to you are one of literally hundreds of thousands of texts that our tradition has around our obligation for tzedakah, for giving money away and how we do it. And while it's still considered in our tradition, in Jewish tradition, an obligation, there's an art to how you do it. And it's something that we think about and talk about very regularly in our community. It's something that we talk about when we're in synagogue. It's something that we talk about in our businesses. It's something we talk about in our families, and it's built into the structure of our entire community. And so I wonder, part of what I think is just important is it's just always a part of the conversation. And I really admire the fact that you are making this even more a part of the conversation. I feel obligated because because two of my mother's friends are here today, and because I just am very proud of my Korean mother, I feel obligated to say, well, I told a story about how she wasn't always so generous to, Muscular Dystrophy Society. She was taking this very Korean principle that you kind of take care of your own. I have to just share one story about her, and show also a very strong value from the Korean community. She came here in 1976 to America, and I feel like while Tacoma, Washington was not a thriving Jewish metropolis, thank God it happened to be a thriving Korean metropolis. Like the Korean community in Seattle, Tacoma is quite large and quite vibrant. I don't know if my dad had been from Montana, it would have been a very different story. And so my mother, with 30 other women, when she first got here, started something called the Korean Women's Association. And it was really like 30 women in someone's living room, mostly to eat Korean food together and talk and complain about, I don't know, their American husbands probably. But anyway, but they realized very soon that there were people among them, women in their community in particular, some of them married to servicemen in particular, who were suffering from some domestic abuse. So the first thing they said is, like, if this is happening in our community, we have to do something about it. So they set up the first sort of shelter for started with Korean women, but then it ended up being for many other women of domestic violence in Tacoma. This led to the next step of realizing there were a lot of elderly Korean parents that were being brought over by their children, and they were entitled by the government to having a home health worker with them. And most of the time these were Americans that didn't know how to cook any Korean food and didn't know how to speak Korean, so they weren't particularly helpful. So the Korean Women's Association said, hey, we could hook up some of these young Korean women to help these older Korean women and men. And so they started this elderly service. And the next thing they knew, they realized they needed elderly housing. So then they applied for grants and they started building units of affordable housing for elderly, at first Koreans, but then it became Asians, and then it became elderly adults in Tacoma. I say this to say, like, fast forward 40 years later, and KWA, Korean Women's Association, now has 1,200 employees and has a multi-million-dollar budget, and is the second largest service organization in all of Washington state, and has built $200 million of affordable housing for people in Tacoma. So it is a kind of one of these incredible stories. And so it started with, like, let's take care of our own, and it actually expanded to become such an important social service for all of Washington. And my mother won this Korean Presidential Prize for her role in it. So, my mom's a pretty good giver too. But I just say that it's a very different attitude, because this was about helping our own, and it was different than money. So but I feel like I cannot tell this community, with the inspiration of the work that you're going to do, to not share that story of my Korean mother, who was a tremendous community builder in that way. So I applaud this effort. I'm really very anxious and happy to hear what your questions are to me. And I feel tremendously proud to represent the Korean community everywhere I go, as a Jew and as a Korean, and in particular for this audience. So thanks for having me. Let's sing. I grew up on a few songs, but this one I always sing. So please join me.